Welcome to the Let's Talk Crypto podcast, where we discuss the latest Bitcoin, blockchain, and digital asset news.
Hi everybody, hope you're all well. It's the 30th of May 2019. Welcome to the 10th episode of Let's Talk Crypto. We're very proud to have finally got to our 10th episode. We're in double digits. And today we are going to be talking about Ethereum. One of the things we want to try and do on this show is educate and help people find out more about the technology, whilst keeping it informal and basic, not delving too deep into the technical aspects in the beginning stages. Because there is so much to cover, we realized that we would never be able to cover it in one podcast, so we're going to split it over two parts. Thank you to all of those who've been listening from the beginning. We've never done this before, so it's been a steep learning curve, but we've enjoyed every minute of it. Love it or hate it, Ethereum has become a big part of the cryptocurrency space. Currently holds the second position on CoinMarketCap. It has attracted an enormous amount of developers. It's captured the imagination of many, and itself has brought many more people into the cryptocurrency space. Even the name itself is quite exciting for those geeks out there, Ethereum. Although still second to Bitcoin in terms of community size, Ethereum has grown by leaps and bounds in the last 4 years. Let me not waste any more of your time. Once again, I'll ask if you enjoy the show, please subscribe and click the bell button if you're on YouTube, or leave us a like, a share, or a comment below to let us know what you think of the show. With that said, let's get going. Today we're joined by Omar.
Yes, hello.
And Slava.
Hi everyone.
And last but not least, Suyash.
Hi everyone.
And then myself, of course, Wes Carlson. Today we're going to be discussing Ethereum. Ethereum holds a very strange place in my mind and heart, as it was the cryptocurrency that I first divested a few of my Bitcoins into when it first came out. I wasn't tempted by any other altcoin up to that stage, including Litecoin. But there was a lot of hype and fanfare around Ethereum, which caused me to dip my toes in as such. I did not do so in the initial coin offering, the ICO, unfortunately. I did so just after the ICO from somebody who wanted to offload just as it was getting listed on Poloniex. I bought it for just over a couple dollars and I sold it again for about $9. Then I traded it a bit and then I bought a large stash of it and held it all the way up to $36. There's a story behind why I traded the cryptocurrency and why I eventually sold and never ever rebought Ethereum again, besides trading activities. And we'll get into that later. But to get us started, let's start right at the beginning, prior to the ICO, with the creator himself, Vitalik Buterin. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Everybody's got a different slant on how it's pronounced. Who is he and where did he come from? If we can just have a little bit of background there on him and basically how the Ethereum blockchain was born. Who would like to take that?
Sure. I can start and then we can all add what we think is relevant because, so from what I know, what I've read that he first, because the cryptocurrency space was not really known as the cryptocurrency space. It was just like the Bitcoin space. So there was just Bitcoin and mostly Bitcoin, right? And then Litecoin came along a couple of years later in 2011 after Bitcoin was introduced in 2009. And then fast forward a few years, this kid from, you'd say teenager from Canada, but also part Russian. I mean, because he's also Russian. He decided he was going to add more functionality to blockchain apart from just being a way to exchange money. So he figured he'd wanted to make it Turing-complete, meaning you can program things on the blockchain. You can write applications, create applications that do other things besides just trying to exchange value. So he proposed Ethereum, I think it was in 2013. And when he proposed, Vitalik Buterin, when he proposed Ethereum, the project gained a lot of interest among a lot of technical minded people, and then it has a lot of different other co-founders as well. So it's not just Vitalik Buterin, who's contributed. There's Joseph Lubin. He's quite prominent, and he owns Consensus, or he founded Consensus, which is like one of the leading organizations that supports Ethereum's ongoing development. And basically, what are we doing with Ethereum right now? We're creating things that are of use, applications that could potentially be of use to people, and a lot of them are similar to traditional applications that are not built on distributed ledgers. For example, we have a decentralized finance. So it's basically taking the concepts from lending and borrowing from traditional finance, and it's bringing it to people in a peer-to-peer manner, so that if I want to lend, if I'm looking for a lender, if I want to let somebody borrow my funds, I don't have to go through a middleman. I can just use Ethereum to applications built on Ethereum to do these things.
All right. Okay. Let's not go too deep there. Let's take a few steps back there. We covered who Vitalik Buterin is. He's, I believe, born in Russia, and his family moved to Canada, so he's naturalized there.
Yeah.
Ethereum was first thought of in 2013, I believe, and first announced in 2014. It has several other founders, although he is most of the time known as the face of Ethereum, or the benevolent dictator, should I say. After that, you mentioned Turing-complete. Let's not let these terms and that slip away with us for the user. What is Turing-complete, Slava?
So Turing-complete is a concept in computer science. That means that you can execute all kinds of operations with the code. So it's not limited only scripts.
Yes. So it's to single instances. So it can run in a loop.
Well, definitely, absolutely one of the features that it has is the ability to create different loops. So it's not a set of instructions, but you can create a loop type of logic. In a sense, from the functional perspective, relative to scripting languages, environments, Turing-complete environments allow for a lot more functionality. And in the case with Ethereum, the traditional paradigm for software development is object-oriented programming, where you have different objects that inherit different values from, Turing-complete is a concept that came from traditional programming and made its way to Ethereum, which was the first blockchain decentralized ledger technology to inherit it. And from the functional perspective, a Turing-complete functionality, Turing-complete environment means that you can do a lot more with the code and different types of functionality and algorithms in the blockchain. So one of the features of a Turing-complete environment is that you can utilize for loops, different types of loops that allow for expanded functionality.
Okay, and I presume that Bitcoin, with its scripting language, is not Turing-complete.
An interesting story. If I recall correctly, the first thing that Vitalik Buterin tried to do is to add that feature and functionality to Bitcoin blockchain. However, he was met with a lot of criticism, and that led to creation of Ethereum in a couple of years after that. You're right, Wes. Bitcoin blockchain has what we call smart contracts functionality, but from my understanding, it is very limited to what it can and cannot do. And it's used rather than using Turing-complete feature set, it is using something called scripting language, where you basically have a lot more limitations to what you can achieve with that.
Okay, understood. And Vitalik was lobbying the Bitcoin community to include this Turing-complete feature. And from what I understand, the Bitcoin community didn't want to have that included due to the multiple things that can go wrong in terms of having a Turing-complete language implemented. And at the time, I think he was working as a journalist, in fact, or part-time journalist for Bitcoin magazine, and if I'm not mistaken, on the Colored Coins project, which Jimmy Song was actually working on. Colored Coins was quite an interesting concept because that was sort of like a precursor to these ICOs where you create tokens on a blockchain.
I think Colored Coins was looking to create a similar type of sort of digital assets or digital securities or whatever you want to call them on the Bitcoin blockchain. I don't know if the project went anywhere. I don't think it did in the end. But yeah, I think you're quite right. Vitalik wanted to, I think via that project, perhaps even he wanted to try and get completeness, if I can put it that way, included into Bitcoin to further that project. There's a story about Vitalik and Peter Thiel. Does anybody know about that?
I can talk a little bit about this. So for our listeners who are not aware of who Peter Thiel is, he's a prolific entrepreneur and investor. Probably everyone heard about PayPal, which was the company that he helped to found. I think his personality is very intriguing to me because I remember from reading his book and just learning about his persona is that he made, I believe he graduated with Stanford Law School, and he absolutely disliked to work in the law school, like law firm environment. And so, after many years after that, when they sold the PayPal and he became wealthy, he established the Thiel Fellowship. Now, Vitalik has earned that award in 2014, and so fellowship basically is intended to students who are very young. I believe it's age 23 or 24, so you have to be under that age. And what they would do, they would offer them $100,000 for the period of 2 years. Not only that, but they would also, the fellowship would also provide necessary resources and mentorship. And they would basically encourage students to drop out of school and just work on a project. And that's okay if you be an entrepreneurship. It could be any type of project, could be scientific, could be social work. But if you create a startup and, for example, if it fails, that's fine. So you still have that resources and you can go and explore the world. And so I guess the big point that Peter Thiel was trying to prove, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that, you can build entrepreneurial skills and build companies that solve real world challenges without having to go through very expensive education system in the West and America specifically. And so Vitalik was one of the fellows that we, probably one of the most famous fellows who has received that award and created, right now as Ethereum.
Okay, very interesting. And Ethereum itself has a very interesting sort of history of milestones. Initially, they had a few prototypes which weren't launched publicly, but obviously for in-house testing. But I think the first one that they released to the public was it Olympic or was it Frontier? I can't remember. And a lot of the first sort of users of Ethereum were then given a client, I think it was called Mist. And within Mist, you could create your own tokens, which I found very novel. And one of the claims on the Ethereum website when it first came out was you could actually build or you could implement a Bitcoin token on the Ethereum blockchain, which I found very interesting at the time. And at that specific time, there was a lot of fighting in the Bitcoin community, much more than you even see now, because now they've obviously split into forks and they fight, the forks fight with each other. But at that time, everybody was still, there was one Bitcoin. And it was quite a funny thing to see another blockchain come out and say, hey, we can actually implement the whole Bitcoin token on the Ethereum blockchain. Obviously, it's not 100% true, but it was a great novelty, if I put it that way. And at that time, Vitalik recorded a video for promoting Ethereum. I'm sure you guys all remember it had a white background and he sort of sat there like a Steve Jobs type of or an Apple style recording video, and he spoke about this world computer and how Bitcoin was like a pocket calculator and Ethereum was like the smartphone that you could build all the applications on, and Bitcoin was like the Nokia 3310, that just made phone calls.
It's really funny. I don't think I've seen that video, but my first reaction when you say the white background, I automatically thought about Steve Jobs videos.
Exactly. I mean, that's the type of aura they tried to build around him, to create this person who had such great vision and who could see the future type of thing and was going to change the world. And they really did spend a lot of time and energy and resources on creating the Vitalik Buterin persona at the time. And it's only in hindsight. I mean, at the time, it did capture people's imaginations. But in hindsight, when I look back at it, and I retrace, some of the videos that I saw, and if I remember what the website looked like, it all looked all space-like and futuristic, and the name Frontier, and it definitely wasn't unintentional. There was nothing unintentional about it. And yeah, so it captured a lot of people's imagination very quickly. It's amazing the marketing job that they did. And in fact, they launched just at the right time when the Bitcoin community, although still one community, was very fragmented internally. And there were lots of different clans. You had the XT and you had the Classic, and clans all wanting their version of the Bitcoin protocol to succeed. And I think that a lot of the success of the Ethereum blockchain was due to that timing. I mean, timing can be everything. And a lot of people actually looked to Ethereum at the time, and there was no fighting. It was peace, love, and unicorns and rainbows. And even if you went over to their Reddit channel, it was everybody was helping each other, encouraging. And then you went over to the Reddit of Bitcoin, and everybody was fighting and censoring and bickering and moaning and pointing fingers. And a lot of people actually left just based on that. They just thought, well, you know what, this thing's going to implode and we're going to go over there. We love sound money. We love Bitcoin. That this infighting is just going to destroy itself, I don't know if any of you were around then, but it was a very interesting time to be in it. And one also has to remember that when it was actually taking place, there was no hindsight. You didn't actually know, what was going to happen next. And yeah, it's interesting looking back now to think like, wow, Ethereum, in a sense, even if it stopped working tomorrow, it succeeded. It captured a large portion of the Bitcoin community's imagination and has captured from that point onwards, a lot of the future market share, which would have likely gone to Bitcoin at the time.
And just to add something, I personally like the way that Vitalik thinks. Basically, he thinks like a programmer. If I take what you said earlier, that is, he wanted to have a programmable system, and Bitcoin wasn't one. Yes, it was started as programmable money, but it was very limited. And what Vitalik really did in its essence is take something that already existed and create a programming language and a programming environment out of it. And that's what is so endearing to me, because my first encounter with blockchain was because of Ethereum. And I wasn't interested in the decentralization part at the start, not even about the fact that it could change a lot of things. I was just interested with the fact that I could develop something on Ethereum. And this is what led to all my other researches, like what is decentralization and Bitcoin and so on. So basically, I personally like the idea behind setting up Ethereum by Vitalik.
That's very, very interesting, because a lot of people usually get more involved in the space via Bitcoin first. And for me, it's exceptionally interesting because there was no Ethereum when I got involved with Bitcoin. So it's like you've got a completely different perspective, which I love. I love to hear it from a completely different angle. I've never thought of it in the way that you just mentioned, of being attracted solely because you were able to develop interesting things on this particular blockchain. It kind of brings us to the point that in those early days, and even up now, Ethereum is moving. Some will argue slowly, but it's actually moving at breakneck speed. And I think there's a different culture with the people who are developing on Ethereum as to the ones who are developing on Bitcoin, for example. Or should I say the ones who have any say in the development on Ethereum and the ones who have any say on the development on Bitcoin. And it's quite different. It's polarizing almost. Ethereum moves at breakneck speed and break everything and find out what works best. There's a terminology for that. I've forgotten what it is, but basically try it. If it doesn't work, pivot, try again, pivot, and so on and so forth. Whereas Bitcoin is conservative, total opposite, where it's don't break anything, be careful, move slowly, make sure nothing breaks. And I'm not saying whether one is right or wrong, because they're two completely different use cases. The one might be more right for something like hard money, sound money, but the other is probably absolutely right for development of and for advancing technology. But yeah, they definitely have two different culture sets, and that is even seen when you go to the different types of conferences, different meetups. It is a different culture which shares a common root, which is basically, I think, the cypherpunk sort of rebellious root.
I felt like it was a very interesting comparison that you pointed out that Ethereum is a lot more agile than Bitcoin. So I guess in a way it's fair to compare Bitcoin blockchain, Bitcoin community to Apple, whereas Ethereum than something like Google, which tends to iterate and try something new a lot more than more conservative Apple.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to do that comparison, I would probably say Apple and Samsung. Because first of all, Apple made the smartphone, Samsung copied it.
What's interesting also is that developers form a large part of the community for Ethereum. And when you compare it with other big like ecosystems like Facebook, like the App Store, Google Play, things like that, you see that these ecosystems have become so large because there were a lot of people who were willing to develop on these platforms. So I think that you were right, Wes, when you said that timing was everything. It was very important in the sense that it allowed developers to have a new environment to basically start playing in that, and this grew and grew and grew. And this is what I believe is a major force for Ethereum.
Yeah, and it was encouraged to come build here. They attracted all the developers, and they also have first mover advantage in terms of a platform that people can develop on. Albeit you can develop on Bitcoin, back then there wasn't really too much you could do. That is changing every day. You've got Lightning Network, you've got side chains, all sorts of things that are coming out now. And again, their timing was good there. And that's what a lot of the Bitcoin community were complaining about and still complain about to this day. And the other folks claim about the current Bitcoin iteration is that it's moving too slow and it's going to lose its first mover advantage. And they wanted things and they wanted it immediately. They could tell that if it wasn't going to happen, there were going to be other blockchains or other competitors that would come out with those features, and they would attract the developers, or they would attract whatever that unique selling proposition was. They were going to attract the users around that, and that's exactly what took place. Now, along with that breakneck speed, things have gone wrong along the way. And even for myself, it was at a time when Ethereum came out, and I was like, downloaded the whole blockchain onto my computer, onto my laptop. I had Mist running. It was running all the time. I had a full node running. I had no hardware wallets. There was very little security. I just trusted, okay, it's on a Mac, so I hope it's not going to get, I'm not getting scammed. What do you call it when somebody phishes you, or key logging or anything like that? And it used a lot of resources, I remember that. But it was actually at a stage when you could actually download the blockchain fairly quickly. I mean, it took a few hours. An hour or two, actually, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 3. And it was continuously updating the blocks, and it had, as I said earlier, the functionality already there where you could go make your own token, etc. And another thing that you could do was take part in the first DAO that was launched, the DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And I did. I took part in that ICO. I took part in just about all the rounds, because as the rounds ticked down, the FOMO kicked in with everybody, and we just ended up buying more and more and more and more of this. And the vision was to create some sort of smart lock, if I remember correctly, linked to a decentralized autonomous organization, that people would have like an Airbnb style company, and they would use these locks, and it would be linked to the blockchain, and we'd all be some inadvertently sort of shareholders of this company. And there were other sort of proposals, and people could make proposals to the company, and you could vote with if I'm not mistaken, I think you could vote with your DAO tokens. Anyway, I was also there when it got hacked and the money was drained. And I bring this up because it's one of the first things big things to really go wrong with Ethereum. And it was quite scary as a user at the time, because I had put a lot of faith into blockchain. It took a while. Remember, in those days there wasn't much track record in terms of adoption. It had been around for a few years, but we didn't have the blocks weren't even nearly full. They were maybe 50% full. There wasn't wide scale adoption of Bitcoin, so we didn't really know 100% that it's been battle hardened and tested and could be trusted. And then came along Ethereum, which was even less. It was brand new. It was even less battle hardened. So for you to take value, and it doesn't matter that Bitcoin price was much lower than, all the prices were much lower than, it was still a substantial portion of money for some people, to put it into Ethereum, and then to take the leap of faith and put it into this DAO, which was quite complicated, mind you, to set up within the Mist client, and quite scary because you didn't want to make a mistake and lose all your funds. And then for it to get hacked, it was quite a scary time. And I, for one, was very lucky because I got word of the hack within seconds, because I just happened to be walking past my computer when it happened, and I was part of a group on Reddit, and the person who spotted it posted it within a minute or two, and the funds were getting drained. I managed to liquidate my tokens on Poloniex within a minute, just before it started plummeting. I actually still walked out with a slight profit, and it was at that point, within 10 minutes after that, I sold all my Ethereums, because we felt that the damage that would be done to Ethereum due to its, attack vectors in terms of language and vulnerabilities that it had, it would never recover from this. The reputational damage would be far too big. Well, it was a bit silly of me back then, but you can't blame me for being a bit naive and a bit scared. But I sold everything, and it's interesting though. The DAO, to this day, a lot of lessons were learned, and I think they've made a lot of adjustments and accounted for that. Does anybody actually know what actually happened there and how that vulnerability was, targeted?
There's few ways to go by it, and I think it's a very significant event, not just for Ethereum, and not just particularly like the loss of, obviously there was a financial or other types of losses that happened with.
Yes, so there's a lot to this, what happened during this attack, and there are many things that can be learned from this event. And there are, I think most people would agree, certain events that took place in cryptocurrency history that are sort of like, have a lot of historical significance now, and they carry a certain meaning. And when people talk about them, those who understand what's going on in this space, certain things automatically come to people's minds. And one of those being what happened with MT Gox or Mt. Gox. And now this is different from that, obviously. It's so what happened here with DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization, was that there was a lot of hype and a lot of anticipation, and people were excited about it. And there was a substantial amount of venture capital that was put into this project to create a self-sustaining type of organization. And it was, like you were saying, Wes, there was a token sale around 2016. Basically, so the DAO was launched, and there was a vulnerability or something wrong in this. The way the code was written, it was not written in a way that would be secure, and hackers managed to exploit a vulnerability in the smart contract code. And as a result, they were able to steal a large amount of tokens. And after that event, in order to restore or undo what the hackers had done, there was a hard fork, and they reversed basically the state of the Ethereum ledger at that time in order to sort of undo the damage, undo those transactions, and sort of undo the damage which had occurred because of the loss of all those tokens. And the community reacted in different ways to what had happened, meaning Poloniex and Kraken, they delisted the DAO, and there was Ethereum Classic that was born out of that.
Before we go too far into Ethereum Classic, what I'd like to talk about here is that exactly what you said. It was a big event. It was one of the big first sort of crises in the Ethereum community. And like I said before, everything was rainbows and unicorns up until that point. The community was also very small up to that point. That's also true to say, compared to the Bitcoin community, which was very large. And with the large size, you have a lot more differing opinions and a lot of different factions, which created a lot of friction. So rightly or wrongly, a lot of the Bitcoiners who saw the Ethereum community with its kumbaya sort of mentality, they joined it. And then this crisis happened. And I wasn't one of the people that joined the community in the sense. I merely took a hedge and bought some Ethereum and bought some DAO. And I was interested, and I was keeping an eye on the whole thing. And what I can say is that when that crisis happened, it was the first time that you saw the community exposed and the arguing. and the differing opinions starting to bubble up to the surface, because it challenged some of the community members' core beliefs and what they thought Ethereum stood for. And that differed from other community members. And one of the differing opinions was whether a blockchain should be allowed to be rolled back for whatever reason, especially for the recovery of funds or for a cataclysmic event of this nature. And there we go. And that's how eventually that Ethereum Classic was born. So it plays a very significant role in the whole Ethereum blockchain sort of chronology or events history, because from that point onwards, you had a blockchain which was technically not immutable, that claimed to be, and you had Bitcoin, which claimed to be immutable. And I still remember at the time, the word immutable, or the phrase that sort of meant the same thing on the Ethereum blockchain, was removed, on the Ethereum website was removed. It used to be there and it was removed. And they replaced it with, and the term unstoppable code was edited slightly. So it just shows how the evolution took place. And I think to date, it's not one of the priorities of the Ethereum blockchains to be as immutable as Bitcoin. I think their goal is, although it changes from time to time and the promises change too, their goal is to be a platform for the new financial industry, if I can put it that way. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
And to add something to the concerning the DAO attack, the DAO attack, is that it's important to understand that the bug which contributed to this hack did not come from Ethereum itself, but from the application, from the smart contracts that were written for the DAO. So basically what happened is that they exploited a specific version. When you think about it, it's like there was an application with thousands and thousands of lines of code, and there were probably like 4 or 5 lines of code which allowed this attack to happen. So basically, they took advantage of a code which wasn't necessarily badly written. It's just that it wasn't like maybe properly tested against hackers and so on. So this is what contributed to this hack. Another thing that becomes very apparent is the fact that in Ethereum, or for any other programmable blockchain for that matter, the funds are so tightly coupled with programming logic that it becomes difficult to avoid such hacks, because directly from the programming functions, you could get access to the funds, you could transfer the funds. And that's when you try to see it from a step above, it's kind of a bad design, in the sense that just by writing a script, you could transfer funds or steal funds. And that's probably something that needs to be addressed in the future.
But that's a good point you bring up, because I remember at the time, a lot of Ethereum naysayers were immediately out in the media, on Reddit, on the forums, claiming Ethereum is insecure, it's been hacked, and they take advantage of the actual event, and the people that you would never change their minds anyway, and they take advantage of the situation. And you rightly say it was actually the application that had the bug, if I can put it that way, the loop, the back door. Not the Ethereum blockchain itself, but it still left a black mark on the community at that time, which I would 100% agree that, it's recovered now. But if we're just looking back at that period, we'll move on to the next. At the time, it cast a lot of doubt on the Ethereum community, because whether they like it or not, it was part of their community, and such an event hadn't technically taken place before. And it's what led to the community splitting into Ethereum Classic and Ethereum. From that point onwards, a lot of emphasis shifted back to the principles on scaling with Ethereum. And originally when Ethereum came out, promise was that it was going to be on proof of stake. It was going to be delivered in its first iterations on proof of work, and at such a time when the technology was sufficiently stable or good enough, the promise was made that Ethereum would move to proof of stake. And there was a difficulty bomb baked into the code. Could you tell us a bit more about that, Suyash or Slava?
The difficulty bomb was included as a way to allow future enhancements in the software. Lately, this has become more apparent with what they term as Ethereum 2.0, with new developments in terms of which would address the scalability problem in Ethereum with sharding and so on. But the problem is with the difficulty bomb is the fact that they kept pushing it forward for valid reasons, probably for valid reasons, because some of the updates or upgrades were not ready or wasn't tested yet. But the fact is that difficulty bombs are quite a double-edged sword. So it's there for a purpose, but if it can be pushed forward randomly or indefinitely, then it's not really of a great use.
Correct. Yeah, I think it's there to incentivize the development to move along at a certain pace and to put pressure on the developers. But as you say, if it can be moved, then what is the point? I'd like to think that it basically is useless unless they stick to it. But at the same time, I don't think they anticipated the growth, the speed at which the value of Ethereum went up, the growth that they experienced. And it became more apparent with that a lot of funds are at stake and that they can't just rush ahead and do things carelessly. So that's what leads them to move the difficulty bomb ahead continuously.
An explanation of the difficulty bomb. So basically, what's the difficulty bomb in Ethereum? The reason it was implemented is actually to deter miners in the future to continue using proof of work when the blockchain transitions to proof of stake. So basically, they wanted to force miners, like, okay, if you're going to continue to use proof of work, it's going to become more and more expensive to do proof of work. So it's not in your best interest to continue with proof of work. Instead, migrate to proof of stake. So basically, it's like a bit like forcing the miners to upgrade to the latest version, which does make sense because they don't want to lose this whole large pool of miners, basically the ones who are supporting and securing the network. So they're like, okay, come to the new version and everything will be fine.
Okay. I'm not as technically minded as you, so I don't know how that works. Because my first assumption would be that the miners that remained on the network would be able to hard fork and get rid of the difficulty bomb. But I clearly don't know enough about that. Ethereum has evolved. Is that correct?
Correct. I believe that they should be able to do that also.
Okay. So, I mean, Ethereum has evolved over from that time. I mean, they already started doing ICOs. Itself was an ICO. And by the way, it wasn't the first ICO, but it was an ICO. It had the DAO, which brought a lot of fame and sort of attention to ICOs. Has Ethereum's promise sort of evolved over time? Initially, it was touted as the decentralized world computer. Then it became an ICO platform, fundraising platform. Now it's going to replace world finance and legacy finance systems. Is it evolving, or is it still holding true to the original promise?
If I may answer that question.
Please.
I think there's a lot of criticism around different projects in general that they are not living up to their expectations. A couple of questions that need to be answered or considered is that paradigm changing. If you're fundamentally changing how you're going to do a certain thing, meaning you're not just introducing, this is not like I have Windows 10 and I'm going to launch a new Windows operating system based on the same core technologies. That's really not what we're doing. So to expect something to develop as quickly as people want them to is being unrealistic. So what we're basically doing with these applications is, in the end, we're writing applications. That's what we're doing, right? And then why would you want them to be decentralized? Some applications, many people would think or agree, is there's no point or reason to decentralize. But if you're having a predictions market where you don't want anybody to be able to shut down the market, or if you want anyone to run the protocol, be able to run the protocol from anywhere in the world without asking for permission, is that if that's your value proposition for any application, then yes, you build applications on Ethereum. Otherwise, you don't. It's not as efficient. It's quite difficult to maintain a decentralized network compared to centralized because it's easy to just implement it that way. So to unrealistically expect something so advanced, so complicated, which has never been done before, to evolve and to achieve mainstream adoption as quickly as some people want it to. Oh, it's been a few years, nothing has happened. That's really being unrealistic, in my opinion. And I think that Ethereum and other projects have done a fair job of reasonably. I would think, in the way I see it, they have, in a way, even exceeded my expectations.
It's definitely far exceeded my expectations. I think if we just go back to the line of questioning, it originally was a world computer, or it could still be. It then started mainstream ICOs, crowdfunding, and now is being used and adopted by a lot of legacy financial firms and industries and similar, and is being sort of marketed that way as the next financial sort of system, the thing to replace, for example, the stock market, as one example. Do we see it continuing in that vein? Is it still going to be all of the above? Will it still have room to do the world computer functions which aren't related to financial aspects? Or is it going to fall into that niche? And I don't mean it in a negative way at all. It's far outperformed what I expected. If I had known what I know now, I promise you I would not have sold my Ethereum tokens. I would not have sold my Ethereum tokens back in 2016 for, I don't know, $30. So yeah.
The way I see it is that you're absolutely right, Wes, because the user-facing definition of Ethereum is changing like every few months based on the
and there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with
definitely,
that. Everything evolves. Nothing sort of stands still.
Correct. It's changing because it's based on the use cases and the applications which are popular at one point in time. Like in the past, there was a game called CryptoKitties, if I'm not wrong, CryptoKitties, which was garnering a lot of attention and which was at sometimes overloading the whole Ethereum blockchain. And at the time, there was a lot of focus on games, on blockchains. And Ethereum was kind of touted as a blockchain which encouraged a lot of game development. It was surprising because it was a valid use case, and the new technologies, and it was a very popular blockchain application. And then it migrated to other, as you said, legacy-based businesses and finding new ways to find solutions to existing problems which are here since a long time. So basically what they are doing is trying to change processes. And now what is happening is people are beginning to understand blockchain. The people in the technical people, but people in their respective industries like education, the government sector, or the financial sector, they are starting to understand what Bitcoin is all about, what blockchain is all about, what Ethereum is all about, and what's the big deal about programmable smart contracts. And now what is happening is they are starting to understand that some of their logic, some of their processes could be migrated to smart contracts, and what translate to is better efficiency in terms of process and things like that. So basically what I believe is going to happen is that Ethereum is going to diverge in a lot of industries as from now. It's maybe going to limit itself to initially to a certain amount of industries, for example, the financial industry. But at the end, I think that it is becoming the world computer in the sense that after some time, most of the industries will have decentralized applications as very popular use cases. And at that time, Ethereum will eventually become the big decentralized world computer that it aspires to become.
All right. I can clearly tell which camp you sit in. Are you sitting on a rainbow or are you riding a unicorn up the rainbow?
Yeah, you could say that.
No worries. Since the Deer hack and that period of time, I mean, Ethereum has come along in leaps and bounds. There's been many iterations. There's been many forks, and I mean planned forks. I don't know, or I can't remember. I haven't followed it that closely to know whether there's been any unplanned forks since after the Ethereum Classic fork. but there's been many planned forks, upgrades, and efficiencies put into the network. Although it's grown in size, it's managed to improve a lot. And there's some very important upgrades that are coming soon. But along the way, there's been new blockchains and new cryptocurrencies that have come out to compete now for this platform blockchain or this platform application layer. And a few of them have got quite a good case for competing with Ethereum, namely EOS, Tron. You've got Tezos. I could probably rattle off a few more, but I'm not aware of all of them, and I'm sure you guys could mention them. But in a world where we had Ethereum competing with Bitcoin for popularity or for community engagement or involvement and for developers, now Ethereum is facing other competition which directly compete with it and will be attracting its developers and users. What do you guys think of that?
I think that this was probably bound to happen in the sense that all this blockchain technology, especially Ethereum, was based on open source software. So based on different use cases, based on the current constraints by the current public Ethereum blockchain, it was bound to happen that people would create their own version of blockchain. Now, the thing to remember is that these separate solutions each have a lot of differences with the public blockchain. And if they wanted to solve a problem, the scalability problem and other things like that, they need to make some compromises. And that's what characterizes these different alternatives. If we take the example of what you mentioned, EOS, and we have POA, proof of authority, all these solutions are in some sense better than the public Ethereum blockchain. However, they do a lot of compromise in terms of decentralization. We could argue that they are maybe less decentralized than the public Ethereum, but on the other hand, they do offer better transaction throughput, lower transaction costs, and so on.
One of the key differences between Ethereum and Bitcoin is the transaction speed. And the Bitcoin blockchain produces a block every 10 minutes, which some say is too long for transactions, especially if you want to have all the transactions in the world on this blockchain. So the Ethereum blockchain runs a block time of about 15 seconds, and they've got a different system to what Bitcoin does, which every 4 years the rate halves, the inflation rate. With Ethereum, it's generated at a consistent rate. So the amount doesn't change. They use a completely different mining algorithm called Ethash. The fees which are paid on the network is called gas. So the reason that they have gas is because with a Turing-complete blockchain, with a Turing-complete language, it's hard to compute. How do I put this into words? This is why, Suyash, you should be saying this part.
Yeah.
Gas prevents applications from consuming an unlimited amount of resources. So that was the method that they used to prevent that from happening, because that could bring a whole blockchain to a grinding halt.
To add to that, the gas is principally used, let's say, to put it very simply, to avoid denial of service attacks on the network. Because the way it works is that when you push information on the network, on the blockchain network for Ethereum, you need to pay a certain amount of fees. And these fees are calculated in terms of gas. Like if you need to push a certain amount of information, you need to pay gas for it. And what happens is that all this information which are pushed to the network needs to be validated by miners. Okay, and so they have a certain value associated with the amount of information. So the gas is used principally as a security measure to avoid denial of service.
So just like we mentioned that the original positioning of Ethereum blockchain was a super global supercomputer, nothing comes real life. And so the way Ethereum blockchain works is that you have to pay gas to perform calculations in the Turing-complete environment. So different calculations will have a different fee attached to it. If you are requesting to perform a more demanding calculation, then you should probably pay a little bit more, and for the resources that you're going to use to accomplish that goal. And adding to what Suyash said, that to create and successfully accomplish a DDoS attack, you will be prevented by having to spend a lot of resources, because gas in a way is Ethereum to convert one to another. But you also would have to provide your resources to make sure that your code, your software works efficiently. And that, in a sense, incentivizes people to create more efficient applications. Why would you want to create software with like 10,000 lines of code if you can do the same software with 100 lines of code? And that is another feature of Ethereum blockchain and gas that is being used on the blockchain, on the network.
Correct.
And that is also interesting in the sense that you can't just continue using resources on the network. So everything that you do in the network becomes valuable. And that puts, let's say, developers or people developing applications in a very different environment than what is traditionally done. Like if you compare developing an application in a cloud-based system versus on the Ethereum blockchain, it's similar in a lot of sense, but it's very different in how you consume and manage resources. Everything you do, everything you push to the network has a value, and it actually costs you something to push information. This is actually, if I'm not wrong, Ether was the first cryptocurrency I bought because I had to deploy a smart contract on Ethereum. So this is why Ethereum is kind of very important to me. And let's say it this way, I'm emotionally attached to Ethereum.
I think I have a good question to Suyash on that note. So in traditional software development, we're talking about object-oriented programming, where you have different objects and they have to communicate with each other. And with Ethereum, they devised the term smart contract-oriented programming. What are the main differences between the two?
I would say that smart contracts, more specifically in the Ethereum blockchain, are not very different from what we have in terms of object-oriented programming in other languages like Java and C# and things like that. In the sense that smart contracts are just basically classes that encapsulates a certain type of entity. For example, you could have a smart contract representing a person and another smart contract representing a property. And then you could relate these two smart contracts by the fact that a person owns a property. So these are the same concepts which apply to object-oriented programming in Java, for example. So the concepts are not very different. It's basically what I see as the biggest differences are the syntax, of course, and the way you do the programming, because you have to add a lot of checks. You have to create, when you create a function which deals with the funds in a smart contract, because remember, a smart contract can also possess funds. Like the funds are not only in users' wallets and so on, but you could send Ether in smart contracts. So a smart contract could be worth, I don't know, $1 million. So basically, it's making a lot of risk management when you're writing applications. And I believe this is why most of the decentralized applications right now are quite simple applications, because the more complex you do an application, the more there's the risk of adding vulnerabilities in the code. So the simpler it is, the less risky it is.
And that brings us to the end of part 1 of What is Ethereum. I hope you've enjoyed it thus far, and I hope you'll be joining us on the next episode for part 2 of What is Ethereum, where we will delve into a few more technical aspects and also into some of the potential use cases that we foresee in the future. Please don't forget to give us a like, share, or comment below. Subscribe if you want to receive updates. Until next time, thank you for listening to Let's Talk Crypto.